You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com.
In today's episode, we have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Diane Mueller. Dr. Diane is an ND, which is a naturopathic doctor, a DAOM, which is Doctor of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine, and an LAC, Licensed Associate Counselor. Dr. Diane is a catalyst for holistic healthcare, armed with a dual doctorate in naturopathic medicine and acupuncture and Oriental medicine. Dr. Diane's the author of the best-selling book, It's Not in Your Mind. She has been featured on Fox News, numerous healthcare summits, and numerous podcasts. Dr. Diane owns two medical clinics, mylymedoc.com and mylibidodoc.com. Dr. Mueller is a leading resource for helping people heal from Lyme disease. She focuses on research that shows the power of herbs for leading the charge with reversing Lyme and mold illness, as well as common reasons why people do not heal. Dr. Diane has fought her own battle with mold toxicity, and she understands the difficult process to heal from toxic mold exposure. Dr. Diane joined us last year, and she explained what she went through when she was battling mold illness. In today's episode, we cover many topics when it comes to toxic mold. We start with the medical testing you can do for mycotoxins, and then we jump to the healing process. Dr. Diane explains why you shouldn't expect to heal in just a few days. Dr. Diane goes over the most common mold illness symptoms. We then talk about Lyme and mold. Dr. Diane explains her reasoning for ERMI testing in your home. We then wrap up the interview with ways that Dr. Diane and her team can help you. I will post a link for you to get in touch with Dr. Diane and her staff. On behalf of all of our listeners, we'd like to thank Dr. Diane for taking the time to educate all of us on the medical side of mold exposure. We look forward to more interviews with Dr. Diane. Now, let's get to the episode. Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley. Today we have a very special guest. We actually had the luxury of having her last year. We have Dr. Diane. Dr. Diane, how are you?
I'm good, Steve. I'm so excited to be back with you. It's just a pleasure to be working with you and chatting more.
Yes. Yeah, we love having you on. I don't bring many guests on. As you know, it's kind of a pain. But I get so many questions on the medical side of things, and I'm sure you get the same on the home side.
Oh,
and
yeah.
We both have to balance where our lane is, but they intersect all the time, and you send me a bunch of clients, and I appreciate that. But the first question that everybody asks, how do I know if I'm toxic with mold toxicity? Can you just start with what testing and how they can do that?
Yeah. And before we even get to testing, I would say the initial thing that would drive somebody to get tested is just a wide variety of symptoms, right? So I think that's where people are like, well, what do I what symptoms are there? And mold and mycotoxins, like the symptoms they cause, they're really the great mimickers because of the level of, distress they cause on the nervous system and the circulatory system. And because they affect these areas that are, say, multisystemic, the whole body, you can largely say that that mold is like a great mimicker of almost every disease, which sounds crazy, but there's such a truth to that. So, the first thing that should drive you to, say, get a mold test, if you're like, I have a laundry list of symptoms, right? It's like this and this and this, and you're like counting on both fingers and your toes, like, yeah, go test yourself for mold. Now, there's a huge debate in the world around urine test versus serum test. And the frustrating part about this debate in my mind is when people are so like, this is the test and this is the test that has to be used versus understanding the pros and cons of both tests. And that's what is important that I think people understand. So the serum test that a lot of people do is a antibody test, right? So it is looking to see, is your body producing the proteins, the antibodies, the immune response to either the spores or to the toxins themselves. So that's great. But as we know from other diseases, such as Lyme disease, the immune system doesn't always respond. And I even was listening to this podcast that drove me nuts a couple months ago, where this person was like, this speaker was like, this is so much better. This is so much better. We got to do the serum. And then at the end of the podcast, Lyme came up and they said, well, we really need something better than an antibody test. And I was like, but you spent this whole podcast talking about how the antibody test was so great for this other thing, right? So if the immune system is working well, right? If the immune system is responding, and if we're talking about the immune system, the other problem with the antibody test is the immune system does not always respond in the same, in just a couple ways. So like most the antibody tests that tend to be run are antibodies called IgE, which are histamine-derived antibodies saying, I have an allergy or a histamine type of response to the mold spores or the mycotoxins. Or the secondary test that's usually run with an antibody test, the serum test, meaning blood, is a test that's called the IgG, which is more like the sensitivity. So that's a different way our immune system is responding. But there's other ways our immune system responds. Like we have a system in our body, our immune system in our body called the complement system. Well, it's entirely possible that our immune system is responding to mold, the spores, the mycotoxins by activating the complement system. And these other antibodies are not even triggered. And so they're going to be missed. And an example of that is we see that with food sensitivity and food allergy testing. When I run tests on that, I run tests that include things like this complement system. And what I see sometimes is people have no problems from an IgE, this histamine response to egg, no problems from an IgE, this sensitivity to egg, but they're responding in this third way, this complement way. And so since the serum blood test for the mold is really generally only looking at these two areas, this IgE and this IgG area, if there's another way the immune system is reacting, or if the immune system is underreacting, which sometimes can happen, then we might not get that same level of response. So that's kind of like the pro and the con. It's not that it's a bad test. It's that with any test, we need to know what it's going to tell us and what it's not. And I know it's the same thing with your work. It's like, it's like saying air sampling is bad. Like, no, air sampling is great. Air sampling just has its limits.
Exactly. Yep. And so I guess my question to kind of follow up with that is, and I love how you said, and I say this all the time, there's no silver bullet test that's going to tell us everything we want to know. I wish
that would be our dream, right?
It would. And, maybe it's something we can invent and, become billionaires. But it's like you said, every test has its pros and cons. But can you speak to on the urine side of it? Because when I hear the urine side of it, the most common thing I get told is, well, if it's in your urine, you're detoxing it. And from my blue collar side, I'm like, well, yeah, but it's still telling me that it was in your body. So can you speak to the urine side of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, so both of those statements are actually true. So if it's in your urine, you are detoxing it. And it's also a sign that it was in your body. Now I can tell you when people feel well and I take them through like pre and post with urine, that the urine samples do go negative. they do go negative. They do change. And so in my mind, what is happening is when we're doing these urine samples and we see the amounts, right? They're quantified. So we see, and they're quantified and color coded like most lab tests where it's like, okay, green range, it's like very low, yellow range, moderate, red, high. Well, if people are coming in moderate, high levels, that means they are detoxing to a high level of exposure, which means it's probably in their house and it's probably related to their symptoms. If everything is like, we all get exposed to a level of talk of mold, right? Like nobody goes through this world no mold free. So I do anticipate people, and it is true, people that are even healthy are going to come in and they're going to see these small levels of things in the green range. They might have gone into a grocery store that has mold. They might have a very, very, very microscopic level of their house beyond, at a threshold below what is a problem. And their body is just detoxing it like normal. But we are not supposed to have this yellow, red level. Like that is a huge sign of exposure. And we can see when people, do work with people like yourself and get the mold out of their house and out of like the places they're being exposed, combined with working with people like me and then detoxing it and killing the spores and getting it out of their body, we do see those levels return back down to green. Now, the one exception I have seen, and I've only seen this a couple times when somebody I hugely suspect has mold in their body. I have seen, like I said, it's been very rare. I've seen a couple times where people their mycotoxin test, the urine mycotoxin test looks good. And then it's like, gosh, this looks like mold. And maybe they're not responding to treatment. And maybe there's a reason to detox them for something else. And we start detoxing them. And then all of a sudden we see those levels go up. So, the theory with this is that we do hold toxins in our fat cells. So the theory with this is like for some people, if they are so sick that perhaps the body is holding these toxins inside the cell. And it's only when we actually support the detox pathways that they start releasing. So that's kind of a thing we need to remember with the urinary mycotoxin test. It's like there can be those exceptions where people are so sick, their body is just not even letting them detox. But I truly have only seen that a couple times in my, 15 years of practice.
Oh, okay. So This brings up a question that it's probably the same way I have to answer everything. It's complex and unique. But let's say that you're treating somebody, their symptoms don't seem to improve, but their mycotoxin urine test, the initial one was high in the red, but now it's not. How do you assess somebody like that? Do you jump to the environmental side like an ERMI, or does that make sense? Like, I'm just curious if you just fully trust that urine sample.
I do fully trust that urine sample. And it is also combined with symptoms, right? So if somebody had like a urine sample like that, and I was like everything in the red and had zero symptoms, in that scenario, I'm still curious, right? Because some people, they're not going to manifest symptoms right away. And we do see that things like ochratoxin is related to research to cause things like Parkinson's disease. Not the only cause, but when I see these mycotoxins there, if somebody's not having symptoms, I still want to make sure they are not, say, accumulating these things because we want to prevent long-term disease. But if I see those levels there, 99% of the time, they're going to have the symptoms to match it. So it's a real clear clinical picture to put together and say, hey, you have the symptoms, we have these results. Now we need to figure out where the exposure is coming from.
I love hearing that because I hear this all the time. And once again, I'm not on the medical side, but I get told quite often that it's a false negative. And I'm like, well, you could have false positives too. So that's a great way to answer that. But this brings me into my next subject. And you and I work with the same people quite often. And one of the most common questions I get for the medical side, which obviously is not me, why am I not healing quicker? Can you talk to our listeners about this? Doesn't happen tomorrow?
Yeah, there's a couple of different reasons. One is the obvious thing around if people are still getting exposed. I have tried more times than I want to even talk about, really, of helping to heal somebody when they are in a moldy place still. And what I have seen over and over, and I've told people this from the beginning around like, we can try to see if we can make inches of headway, but I don't anticipate it's going to work. I always tell people that up front. And sometimes people still want to try. And in the end, people will not feel better if they're still living, working, breathing in these toxins and spores because we can't get ahead of it, right? It's like we give things to kill the spores or to detox the toxins, and all of a sudden you just breathe it right back in or it goes in through your skin, and we're right back where we started. So we can't ever move the needle. So that's certainly one thing. But I think another huge thing that people don't realize is the widespread damage that this, will do and the widespread dysfunction. So for example, one of the things that we see with mycotoxins is it's very common to see a lowering of something called vasoendothelial growth factor, VEGF. And what VEGF does in the body is it helps us grow new blood vessels.
I'm glad you didn't ask me to say that, by the way. That's a tough word to say.
I always wonder, I'm like, can we just make things like what VEGF does is it helps us grow new blood vessels. So why can't we call it the grow new blood vessel molecule? That would be way easier, right?
Right.
But we like to make things very complicated in medicine. And so mold essentially will cause this particular molecule that allows us to make new blood vessels. It'll cause this molecule to decrease in the body. So we think about this. We think about every cell in our body needs blood, needs oxygen to function. And so now we are in a state where cells are starved of oxygen, where cells all over their body are losing their functionality. They're breaking down, right? We have situations where the lymphatic system, which is the garbage collecting part of our body that scours the body and picks up trash, where the lymphatic system can get very, very backed up. So now we have cells breaking down and they can't even get rid of their broken down products because the trash can't be taken out because this other system's, so backed up. And then furthermore, we see that some of these toxins, especially things like the fusariums and stachybotrys, they love to cause our nerve cells to die. Well, our nerve cells cause conduction. They cause the communication of our whole body. They make our whole body work. So now we have our nervous system that's inflamed. We have nerve cells that are dying. So now our body is not getting stimulated to repair. And then furthermore, we can see that we get inflammation into areas of the brain, such as the hypothalamus, which is the upper regulatory part of our hormones. So the hypothalamus of the brain is triggering the thyroid to work and the adrenals to work and the ovaries and the testes to work to produce sex hormones. And then that signaling pathway gets broken down. So it really becomes not just about getting the spores out and getting the toxins out, which does take time. It's also that we have all of these areas of the body that have been damaged, and going through this damage for years, sometimes even decades. And then we don't have to just get the toxins out. We have to give enough time and give enough support to each area of the body that got destroyed to actually repair. And this is, it's like the body is amazing. Thank God we know now that the nervous system can repair itself. Otherwise, this is dramatically scarier, but it still takes time to do all this work.
Yeah. And that's a great answer. I think a lot of people I want to backtrack a little bit.
Yeah.
I want to address the whole, you've got to get out of the environment. For our listeners, they hear me say this all the time. They're hearing a doctor say it, but they must get out of it, because the way I say it to them is you've got to put the fire out, the fire being the mold. There's still going to be some smoke, which is the mycotoxins. But if you don't get out of the environment, it's just so difficult. And then the next thing I always hear is, well, Steve, you don't understand. My money's tight or this and that. And I'm like, well, I understand it, but you've got to get out of that environment. But then once you're out, like you explained it so well, your body has to recoup itself. But I want to ask you something that I should have probably addressed earlier. But with all the thousands of patients you deal with, what are the most common mold toxicity symptoms?
I'd say headaches and migraines are probably the top, the brain related things. That's probably the top things that come up. There is a huge amount of neurological, say, dysfunction, whether it's something like depersonalization, which is the weirdest one for people to describe, where it's almost like this is what I had in mold. The way I would describe it is it was almost like I was detached from my body, and it was like my brain would look down on my body. It was like my brain and my body were not one. Very, very weird. But a lot of people will go through that. Brain fog is really common, but some level of pain, whether it's the headaches, migraines, whether it's fibro, whether it's joint pain, I would say if I have to pick one symptom that I see most commonly in everybody, it's that. But that's definitely not everybody. And I want anybody that's hearing this to also know that just because you have pain does not mean that your symptoms couldn't be mold, because it really is the great mimicker. Nausea is actually another really common one that a lot of people don't realize is connected. But I do have a lot of people with nausea, and then insomnia. And this is the type of insomnia that like some people don't even respond to Ambien, right? It's like you try melatonin, you try edibles, you try whatever, all of these like natural things, and Ambien sometimes doesn't even work. And it's because the brain is so inflamed, and it's very difficult for the brain to rest when it's inflamed. So there's like nothing that touches the level of insomnia that these people have sometimes.
Wow. So you specialize in Lyme. So I want to go down that path. And one of the latest things I've been hearing, well, I should say that people are telling me that they believe is true. So I just want to hear your take on it. I'm hearing that Lyme is being misdiagnosed and it's actually mold. But from what you told us in our interview last year, a lot of times they coincide with each other. Having Lyme and then being exposed to mold is what, overflows the bucket. Can you talk to our listeners about the misdiagnosed with Lyme and then the connection between that and mold?
Yeah, I think misdiagnosis is often the wrong way of looking at it if people have had lab tests, run. But one of the problems that I think happens a lot in the Lyme community is people will go get the Lyme diagnosis, and getting a diagnosis is sometimes like a really good thing, but it's sometimes the worst thing that can happen, because what we'll tend to have when a diagnosis is given is that people, meaning doctors as well as the patients, think their job is done. So if somebody has a Lyme diagnosis and their treatment's not working, they might seek out another doctor, a Lyme expert, and they say, hey, I have Lyme. The last treatment didn't work. What do you have for me? And that doctor wants to, give their patient what they want, and they already have that Lyme diagnosis. So then that doctor oftentimes just tries a different treatment and it doesn't work. And then they move on to the next and the next and the next and the next. And, sometimes I see people and they're 9 or 10 treatments into the Lyme and they're not better yet. Well, does that mean they don't have Lyme disease? Well, no, it doesn't mean that at all. Like, certainly could, but if they have that positive test, that probably was Lyme disease. But like we're saying here, it can be Lyme and. So I would say it's more of like a underdiagnosis of like not having that full picture of all the things involved. Because I've also seen situations where people treat mold and they're not totally better, and you look for Lyme and it's there. And sure enough, you have to treat the Lyme. So if you've seen a dozen people and you've had a lot of Lyme treatments, it's very possible that the Lyme was there and it was killed. But it's just that you have two major root causes causing similar symptoms, and getting rid of one, while necessary, isn't enough to alleviate symptoms because the other is such a major player in the picture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question I have about Lyme is, and I can't remember if I've been told this by some of my clients or I read it somewhere in a Facebook group, but is there any truth to the fact that there's talk out there that Lyme is not you can have Lymes without being bitten or whatever a tick does? Sorry, I didn't know how to word that. But...
No, you're right. It's a really important question. So I've seen one study that showed mosquito and one study that showed a flea bite. So, that's like these are very small studies, very small samples. How common that is, it's truly unknown. But what we do know is that Lyme shows no borders, right? This thing that we think sometimes that where we're like, oh, these borders where it's like, it's only in the Pacific or in the, not Pacific, New England states. Like, I'm so frustrated the number of times people are like, well, our doctor says it's not here. Well, maybe it got discovered it did get discovered in Lyme, Connecticut. But, we know that viruses and bacteria and parasites, these microorganisms, it's not like they get to state lines and they don't cross.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And then there's studies of like songbirds. These songbirds, they get the infected tick larvae in their gut. They feed on mice and stuff. And they get these infected tick larvae in their gut, and then they fly and they defecate on the earth. And what they're defecating is the larvae of these infected ticks. So through birds, this is one of the ways that we know that Lyme disease spreads. So it's definitely possible there's these other, what we call vectors, these other insects that, that are spreading disease. But ticks are certainly the predominant one. So the most important thing to realize is like, it's not just in the New England states. And the other really important thing to know with this is the bullseye rash, that classic like target lesion that everybody looks out for, really only is found in 25 to 30% of people. So a lot of people don't get that rash. And remember, we can also have it in our hairline where it's like, if I got a target lesion on my head, on my scalp, like you're not going to find that in all my hair.
Right.
So, so there's also that thing that it could be hidden and you might not see it. And then the final thing with that is that initially, contracting Lyme can look very similar to the flu. And so people can get it. It can be self-limiting, like it can be more severe where people take antibiotics and have all the classic things, but it can also look like the flu but if it's like that flu and it's not treated, it's not that it goes away, it's that it goes into dormancy. And that's where it's like, then we move into a moldy place or we have a mold exposure. And that can be that key that turns, brings Lyme out of dormancy. And in that case, then we have a situation where, we have this new mold exposure plus the Lyme out of dormancy. And it really is that both ands.
Okay.
Yeah.
That brings up another subject that is brought up quite often. Those that have, and I don't know for sure, you'll explain it all, but there's a gene that 20 to 25%, I don't know if they have a definitive number, that they have that prevents them from detoxing mold or mycotoxins like another person. Can you tell our listeners about that and that testing?
Yeah, it's the HLA-DR test. And so essentially what that is, if you have that genetic anomaly, and it is estimated about a quarter of the population has that, I think probably more data needs to be done to see, okay, well, how is that accurate or not? But it's a lot. We do know it's a huge percentage of the population that has that. And so essentially what it is, the best way I found to describe it, it's a tagging problem with our immune system. So when we have a spore or a mycotoxin inside of us, what happens is our immune system puts this tag on the spore or the toxin. And that tag lets the rest of our body know that this is a bad thing. It's like, because our immune system's always trying to identify, is this bad or is this self? Is this bad? Is this self? So the tagging mechanism is like, hey, this is bad. This is not me. So now I got to get this thing out, right? I got to bring the troops and bring the forces. And so the problem is with you have this HLA-DR abnormality, then that tagging mechanism is what is deficient. And so when that tagging mechanism is deficient, it's the immune system then doesn't see it as bad. And therefore it's not assembling the troops inside to actually remove those toxins and they build up in the body. But there can be cases where people still accumulate mold in their body without that immuno issue. It's just a lot less common.
Oh, okay. That's interesting because you brought up something like that, with the Lyme and being dormant. And it just made me think of, I hear that term all the time with mold on the environmental side. Like, well, that's dead mold. And I'm like, no, it's actually just not it's dormant. It's just not viable. It's not pollinizing and reproducing. And it's just interesting that on the medical side, it's similar to that. But something else that I talk about all the time, and we talked about this last year, and I've been trying to remember to tell my clients this, talk to our listeners about how important it is to document all of their symptoms. Because it kind of brings us back to why am I not healing quicker?
Yeah, it's so connected to that. And thank you for bringing this question up because it is so amazing to me how many times people actually think they are not healing and they are. So the story that I give a lot is, there's many examples of this, but my favorite story is the one I tell because it was so phenomenal, the power of what I'm about to say. So I had this patient, the number one symptom she came to me was this, like these neuropathy type of face tingling. Her whole face would feel like pins and needles. It was keeping her up at night, driving her nuts. This was one of the easiest people that I have, helped in this regard because while we were waiting for testing, all I did while we were waiting is I took her off gluten. So she comes in to go over tests. It's like, we really haven't started treatment. And I still ask her like, hey, you noticing any difference? And she's like, oh no, Dr. D, like everything's the same. I feel the same. So I go over the list of symptoms that I took, the laundry list that I write down on day one of working with somebody. And I was like, how's that face tingling? And she's like, Dr. D, it's totally gone. I completely forgot about this. This was the number one thing that drove her to my practice. So it's, the point here is the brain orients to tracking when we're sick what is wrong. So as a healthy person, I don't wake up every day. I wake up and do my gratitude exercises in the morning, but I don't wake up and think like, wow, no headache today. Wow, my knees don't hurt. Wow, my lungs feel good, right? Like that is not what most of us do in the morning. But when we're sick, and I remember this from when I was sick and I was, I had Lyme and mold and all the things. And I would do that kind of like body scan. I would wake up and be like, okay, how bad's my head today? How bad is this? And there's that like just, oh, am I going to be able to make it type of scanning? And so our brain, when we're not well, orients to all the things that we're trying to fix. And this is like, I describe it as like the survival mechanism, right? Because it's our brain saying, these things are wrong. We need to fix them. So when our laundry list is really long, it's our brain is constantly going to be like, this is a problem. This is a problem. This is a problem. And what I've seen in practice is most of the time people do not operate like this example, sadly, meaning most of the time, the things that fall away first are the things that are like the least annoying things. Like, every once in a while, my pinky toe, like once a day, my pinky toe just like throbs for 2 seconds like I stubbed it. Well, it's like not that big of a deal compared to a lot of other people's symptoms, but it tends to be those things that start falling away first for most people. So if we don't track, we don't have a laundry list of like written down that we are like tracking and rating the severity, then it's so easy to get into this thing around like, oh my gosh, nothing's working, when in fact, like things are working, but our list is so big that we just haven't even noticed.
Yeah. And for our listeners that didn't listen last year, Dr. Diane has battled all of this on her own. And I think that's what makes it so relatable for you. A lot of my clients are like, well, I'm assuming, Steve, you've been through this. And I'm like, no, actually, I haven't. Like, I understand it, but you have been through it. But you mentioned something, and this is another hot topic, and that's food and mycotoxins. And once again, I know we all have differing opinions. I'm more of the opinion that I think obviously mold in food can make you sick. But on the other hand, I think you have to have exposure at home. Can you address the whole food making everybody sick?
Steve, I really wish these lab tests that came back and said, hey, you have mold in your body. I really, really wish they would actually remove the part where it says food sources. Like what needs to be there is this is likely an environmental, source. And maybe there are some foods that are, also having a small role in this. And because in order, yes, there are things like some coffees have mold in them. Some, peanuts have aflatoxins. Like we see that there are these foods that have mycotoxins in them, yes. But people would have to eat like I would need to see probably somebody eating like jars of peanut butter before I'm going to see their labs go into these high ranges. And I say that because one, I have seen many times in my practice where people eliminate these foods and, maybe their digestion, if they're having some sort of like reaction, right? They're like, oh, peanuts don't do well in my body. Like maybe getting peanuts out, you can have a small change, but I'm talking small. I've never seen anything where people have major changes. And I've also seen, I've talked to other colleagues that have run internal studies where they've done things like test, remove foods, retest and no change, and then test, add in all the mycotoxin heavy foods and retest and no changes on labs. So I'm very, very medically convinced at this point that, yes, some of these foods, if they have mold toxins, like maybe they have a small level of impact. But if that's what people are thinking are going to make the change when they have this laundry list of symptoms and living in mold, the food doesn't come close. It's so microscopic, the level of exposure people are getting compared to the environment. And I've never seen anybody dramatically change their life, even largely smallly change their life from a standpoint of eliminating mycotoxin foods in these situations. And I think it really does such a disservice to people to see this on the lab test because it's such an easy fix compared to working with somebody like you, right? So it's like people want to believe that because it's so much easier to be like, I'm going to get rice out. I'm going to get, peanuts out instead of really going and fixing their home. But it's really a problem because it's leading people to believe that, hey, we can just go down this track of just eliminating these foods and then eventually I'm going to feel better. And like I said, I've never seen it work and people waste a lot of time and a lot of frustration by not going to that source.
Okay. I'm glad to hear from the medical side. Not that, we don't like to gloat when we're right, but
Yeah.
I'm not a big believer in it. So that was a great answer. So that brings up something else. And a lot of our listeners, they will reach out and they'll say, Dr. Diane recommended me to them, and my score's a 25. Can you talk to our listeners about the importance of the ERMI score and where you like to see it drop to?
Yeah, I think the reason the ERMI gets such a bad reputation is one, because it was originally created as kind of a research thing and was not created to do what we're doing with it. That is true. That is, something to, I think, just name. And another big thing that really gets the ERMI a bad reputation is the scoring system is really wonky, right?
Yeah.
And so the scoring system is like, oh, you have to be less than a 0 in order for this in order for this house to be safe. And I can tell you, after like seeing thousands of ERMIs, I've never seen one of those like less than 0, right? And that's after like remediations and all these things. And when people start feeling better even. So I think the biggest thing that in my, like how I use the ERMI is an initial screen that just says, hey, is there a problem? Is there not? Do we need to bring in somebody like yourself to really get in there and find it? And a benefit of it is that it is a surface sample. And so we're collecting from the standpoint of those heavier molds or Stachybotrys, those things that don't suspend in air. The scoring system, like I said, is the biggest problem. And so less than 10 is good. I do see people that do okay less than 10, but even better, where I really try to get my clients, is actually less than 7. And I see if we can get into that less than 7 range, that is like where I have not had a single person that has had a 7 or less have a problem with living in the house. So, and that's just what I've observed clinically over the years. So, I think it's a useful task, as you and I talked offline, like all of these things, like we want to know they're positive, they're negatives. We want to know that this is like not by any means the end all be all, that you need that inspection and you need somebody like you coming in and doing all your, your magic. But it can be valuable. We just want to make sure we're interpreting it not like they say, because their interpretation's definitely wonky on that test.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like you said, the ERMI, to me, it's no different than doing an air test. And so for our listeners, so they can hear Steve talk about it and Dr. Diane, it's similar. We both know an air test is only going to do so much for us. Heavier, stickier, tackier mold types are going to be on surfaces. And from what you were just saying, like, let's not just take what our ERMI's telling us and go to the bank with it. Let's look at your symptoms and everything else. But as far as the ERMI, I want to just ask you a question from your perspective. So let's say we have an ERMI score of 20 and they have remediation done and now it's 30. What does that tell you?
Oh, it tells me that they probably stirred with one of two things. Either they stirred something up in the remediation, it wasn't, contained, and, that's a problem, right? So they've spread it around, the problem's gotten worse. Or it could be as simple as they did not clean and they retested too quickly. So that's, what, you and I have talked offline around like the small particle cleaning. And usually I tell people to hire somebody for that. But at the minimum, if they're like everything else has been hired out and they want to clean themselves, then literally wiping down every single surface with that like Swiffer type of, sticky pad. And I'm sure you have a bazillion more things that you can, give people on that too. But that's a big sign to me around like, hey, the cleaning may have not been done super well. And that could be an example of a, potential false positive. And that's also something to be said too, because we can still react to those mycotoxin fragments when we get that active mold out and the spores, and we don't have those toxins in the air, even if the air has been cleaned. But if there's still some of those fragments laying around, we can still be reacting to those. So that, that small particle cleaning that you do is a very essential part of it. And it's possible that hasn't been done yet. And that's what's driving up the ERMI. So that's my opinion.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
I find that interesting because everything you said was spot on. And I think what a lot of our listeners don't understand is, and we all understand that money's tight. I don't know anybody that has a money tree. If you do, just let me know where some seeds are. But we try to save money on certain things. But what typically gets missed is the final SPC, the small particle cleaning. But on the other hand, if you don't have the proper containments and negative air while you're removing it, that's what it's going to do. So to start wrapping things up, As far as our listeners, can you just tell them you're based out of Colorado? I'll obviously record the bio and go over everything. So for our listeners, there'll be information and sites that I'll put. But explain to our listeners how they can get a hold of you, how to reach out to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So the easiest thing is just go to My Lyme, Lyme, mylymedoc.com. And I am based out of Colorado. My MD is, that's been training with me for 7 years now. She's been in practice for 20. Really good, really knowledgeable at this. She has 5 other states she's licensed in besides Colorado. So we can offer some around the country. And then I also have a online group education program that is education only, but I teach you the steps of healing from Lyme, healing from mold. It is required you are working with a doctor because, like I said, this is done from an education standpoint. But because it is education, I'm just teaching, I can actually do that. You can join that program from really anywhere around the world. So that's another easy way if you're like, hey, you got your care team together, but you just need somebody that can educate you and help you, and you can learn the steps to heal. You can do that online group program as well from anywhere.
Okay, perfect. Because I have a lot of clients, I'm sure you do, across the globe. Yeah. And the biggest complaint is they can't find someone locally. And like you said, it's an education. They can have other things in place to help them get through the process. So for those listeners, Dr. Diane can help you. Just go to her website. I'll post it in the comments. But on behalf of all of our listeners, Dr. Diane, this is the second time you've been willing to come on to the Toxic Mold Podcast. We appreciate you coming on, and we will obviously keep trying to keep bringing you on in the future, because every episode we do, there's always something else we talk about. So thank you for being on the Toxic Mold Podcast. And I want to thank all you listeners.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.